Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting edge issues shaping national security and defense. It's Thursday, December 5th, 2024. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. A lot has been happening in the Canada relationship as of late, between calls for Canada to increase its defense spending, the potential for President elect Donald Trump to implement 25% tariffs on Canadian exports, border security, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's recent visit to Mar-a-Lago. Here to talk about the latest in U.S. Canada relations and the implications of a second Trump presidency, we have our fellow, Xavier Delgado, Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. This is the Expert Series. Xavi, thanks for coming back into the Expert Series. Always great to have you on. Always great to hear from you, our counterpart down in Washington.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Although I don't know why you'd want me back. It's not like anything exciting has happened over the past.
No, not at all. It's not like we don't have anything to talk about at all. Well, everyone, thanks for tuning in. We have Xavi back. He helps run the Canada Institute over at the DC-based Wilson Center. And contrary to what we just said, we actually have a lot to talk about in regards to Canada's relations. Unless you've been hiding under a rock for the past several weeks, things have been about as interesting as they could be in the past few years. So Xavi, a lot to talk about: Trump, tariffs, CUSMA, a Mar-a-Lago visit. Why don't we kind of begin unpacking some of these issues for our audience? As we approach a second Trump presidency, where would you say Canada's relations stand at present? What are the incoming Trump administration's main priorities or concerns regarding Canada? And from this vantage point, what do you think the relationship could look like?
It's interesting, Josh. I don't think anybody outside the North American policy space would have predicted that Canada and Mexico would take such a big priority in the Trump administration this early on. I mean, the border and immigration was obviously going to be on their radar. It was one of their top campaign issues. But if you'd asked me even just a week and a half ago, I would have said that the top issues are going to be ending the war in Ukraine, ending the war in Gaza, and then pivoting to focus on China. Canada and Mexico flew a little bit under the radar. So I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. But the border has been an enormous issue for the Trump administration. It was a big issue for the campaign. Exit polls in the US election showed that it was a big issue for voters, right behind the economy. And so perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise that one of the first major policy announcements from President-elect Trump was that he was going to impose these tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Now, of course, saying you're going to impose tariffs is different from actually imposing them. He did caveat it by saying that they'll be imposed if Canada and Mexico don't change course on border security. But I think it was shocking to see it for a lot of people, coming out before even he made a statement on the situation in Gaza or the situation in Ukraine. And this has been consistent. I mean, one of his first high-level appointments that he's announced, or sorry, nominations, not appointments, was the ambassador to Canada. The ambassadorial appointments went Nikki Haley, I believe, for the United Nations, his ambassador to Israel, his ambassador to NATO, and then his ambassador to Canada. So North America is clearly on the president-elect's mind. And for anybody who thought that Canada would recede into the background as a non-priority for the new administration, I think that the president-elect's actions over the past few weeks show that North America and Canada are going to be front and center on the agenda.
Well, Xavi, thanks for that primer. You just pointed out a lot of issues here, including tariffs, ambassadors. We have a lot to discuss still. Before we dive into a lot of that, I'm wondering if you might be able to tell us a bit more about the new ambassador to Canada, maybe a little bit about their background, if you could, and maybe give a sense of what their appointment could mean for the relationship, or how it could help, how it could hinder.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's significant to note that Peter Hoekstra, who is the ambassador nominee for U.S. ambassador to Canada, is a former congressman who represented a district in Michigan that's now represented by Congressman Bill Huizenga. So he's a northern border elected official. And he was a Trump ambassador in the first administration. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. So he has ambassadorial experience. He has northern border experience. He's a previously elected official. I think it shows that the Trump administration is, again, going to take Canada very seriously. They're not throwing somebody into the soup who doesn't have experience with Canada. Peter Hoekstra understands the Canada-U.S. relationship. arguably more so than a lot of other options would have. I mean, he's represented people in Michigan. Michigan has a very close relationship with Canada, especially Ontario, which it borders. He's going to be very familiar with a lot of the files on day one. I think that bodes well for the Canada-U.S. relationship. Again, it shows that this is not a relationship that the Trump administration takes lightly. If you're in Canada, that is both good and bad news because it means Canada won't recede to the background, but it also means that the Trump administration will be placing a lot of its desired policies high up on the priority list, and that can mean they're going to play hardball with the Canadians.
Well, thanks, Avi. Before we get into a bit more of the meat of this discussion, the implications of tariffs, our bilateral relationship as it pertains to defense, possibly even America's place in the world, etc. Something very interesting happened over the past few days. There's been a lot of media attention. Prime Minister Trudeau actually went to Mar-a-Lago recently to meet with President-elect Trump. Before we get into some more of the nuances of this latest kind of phase in our relationship, I'm wondering if you might be able to talk with me about some of the key takeaways from the Mar-a-Lago meeting, what it means for Canada.
Yeah, I mean, all we know is what the official there's been no official statement as far as I'm aware at this time, but we've heard from readouts, we've heard from sources that what they talked about was mainly border security. They talked about the tariffs, they talked about the trade deficit, which was a big focus of the president-elect. I mean, Canada and the United States have an enormous, very complex trade relationship that involves energy, goods, services. Canada is the largest foreign supplier to the United States for crude oil and petroleum products. So the trade deficit is a big focus of the second Trump administration. We know that was discussed at the dinner. I think the more interesting takeaway from that is that Prime Minister Trudeau is taking the lessons that he has learned from the first Trump administration and applying them to the second Trump administration. One of the Liberals' main talking points in the wake of President-elect Trump's victory in the U.S. elections was that Prime Minister Trudeau has experience dealing with him on a prime minister to president level. People have made a lot of focus on the icy relationship that they had during the first administration, and I think that the prime minister's actions now show that he's cognizant that having an icy relationship with President-elect Trump in the second administration wouldn't bode well for him, wouldn't bode well for the Liberals, and frankly, wouldn't bode well for Canada. So I think we see that experience, knowing how to work with the president-elect, come into play here, and that's part of the reason why he was one of the first, if not the first, world leader to come down to Mar-a-Lago and meet with President-elect Trump in person.
Now, Xavier, for our American listeners, in case you wouldn't already know, we're going to have an election in 2025, and it's looking, anything can happen, but it's looking increasingly likely that Trudeau is probably what we'd call a lame duck prime minister. Polling indicates that conservatives will probably win a very decisive victory. Again, anything can happen between now and then. That's a lifetime in politics. But let's say that the current kind of status quo thinking on this holds. Trudeau maybe has a year left, tops. Can you comment on, how the Trump administration might perceive that, how it might impact dynamics between Canada and the U.S. or at the heads of state level?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it would all be speculation at this point. As far as I know, there's no existing relationship between Pierre Poilievre and Donald Trump. Other than that, I believe the opposition leader called the president to congratulate him on election night. So there is no formal relationship. Mr. Poilievre has deferred authority on the Canada-U.S. relations to the prime minister when asked about it in press conferences in the wake of the tariff announcement. So it's difficult to predict. I just given the history between President-elect Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, um, I wouldn't be surprised if many people in the Trump camp are skeptical of the prime minister, skeptical of his approach to diplomatic relations, especially after incidents like the hot mic incident, if you remember, Josh, back at the NATO summit in 2019, when the prime minister was caught making fun of President Trump's press conferences, or then following his loss in 2020, when now President-elect Trump tweeted about how Justin Trudeau was, I believe the word was liberal maniac or far left lunatic or something. And so no love lost between the two leaders prior to the US election. Now you see a bit of the warming of the relationship. I don't know how authentic that is for people who are celebrating the prime minister's visit to Mar-a-Lago as a win. There's a photo that I like to share on social media of um, before he was senator, Mitt Romney dining with.
Oh, yes.
It'd been 2016, I believe, when he was in talks to become Secretary of State. The photo of the prime minister and the president look a lot like that, actually. So just because they got dinner together doesn't mean that everything is repaired. It doesn't mean that the tariffs won't happen. It doesn't mean that Canada-US relations won't go through a rough patch, but it also doesn't mean that they're bad right now. It's really any prediction about the relationship based on this visit would be speculation. And I think anything about the opposition leader and President-elect Trump or how his team perceives the conservatives and Pierre Poilievre would also be speculation.
I am well aware of the aforementioned photo you described, and I do agree that there appeared to be some similarities there with the at the table with Trudeau as well. Now, Xavi, one of the primary concerns, what might the underlying rationale behind the proposed tariffs on Canada be, and how likely do you think it is that they will be implemented given, potential economic and diplomatic consequences? 25% tariffs potentially.
Well, one of the nice things with dealing with President-elect Trump, at least from what I can perceive, is that he's very direct and he's very open. If he says that the situation is about the border, it's about the border. And that doesn't mean that the administration won't have concerns about things like defense spending, about the broader trade deficit, about any other policy. I mean, name it. It could be a flashpoint for Canada-US relations. But these tariffs are about the border. That's what they're about. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So to talk about anything except the border, to say, oh, maybe we can leverage, I don't know, say we're going to spend more on defense instead of addressing the situation at the border, I think is a little silly. Um, the way that Canada gets around this is by addressing the United States' concerns about the border. And I think actually a lot of people were surprised to see Canada looped in with Mexico on this. And while it's true that I mean, most of the US focus is on the southern border, just given the scale of some of the immigration issues down there. The reality is, for a lot of northern border members of Congress, governors, um, northern border security has been a real issue. I mean, the Canada-US border, it's the longest demilitarized land border in the world, 5,525 miles long. I won't try and do the conversion to kilometers in my head, but only 118 ports of entry along that. That's a lot of land in between the ports of entry. And we've seen an actual rise in encounters by Border Patrol agents on the US side, almost 950% across a 2-year period from 2022 to 2024. I think the number in 2024 was 23,700 or something in that ballpark. So this is a real issue that Republicans have raised here in the US. There's a Northern Border Security Caucus led by Republicans. It's been flagged over and over again during the campaign. Then candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, who's now, of course, in the Trump inner circle, and I think the official title is co-commissioner of the Department of Government Efficiency, even proposed building a border wall. And I won't talk about the merits of that idea, but it goes to show the real concerns that the Republican Party had with the northern border. And now that they control not just the White House, but also both chambers of Congress, I'd expect a lot of these voices who were very vocal during the campaign to continue leading on it during the administration.
Zavi, I'm wondering if we might be able to get into some of the particular or most pressing border security concerns from the perspective of the incoming Trump administration, and then from there, what kind of actionable things can Canada put into place, sort of immediately and maybe in the more medium term, to signify that they're willing to work on some of the concerns that the United States has in terms of border security?
Well, I think the Canadian government has been very intentional in its approach so far. They've said that they consider the border to be secure, but in a show of good faith and to show that they respect the United States' concerns, I believe they've promised to increase helicopter patrols along the border, to increase staffing along the border. You know, things like this show that even if Canada believes they're doing a good job securing the border, they hear the United States, and because the United States is a friend, partner, and ally, they're willing to expend more resources in securing the border. I think that's the right approach. I think that will show the incoming administration that Canada takes its concerns seriously, and is probably a good first step to deterring the threat of universal tariffs.
How effective do you think Minister Bill Blair's response to the criticism regarding defense spending, particularly his assertion that Canada is working to increase military spending, will be in convincing both U.S. lawmakers and domestic critics of Canada's commitments to NATO?
It's a good question. I'll start with the first part as to whether it's perceived as being, um, as to how it's perceived here in the United States, which is that not well. I don't think the commitment by the current government to increase defense spending is taken very seriously, especially when you have the Parliamentary Budget Office coming out and saying, actually, our initial projections for the end of the decade were a little ambitious. We're going to be closer to 1.5, I believe, percent, than to 1.72% by 2030. That doesn't bode well. And the fact that we've announced we're going to hit defense spending by, I think the plan was 2032 or 2034 was the year we hit 2%, but we haven't released a cohesive um, plan to show how we're going to get there. Um, Shows the United States that maybe this is just something Canada's throwing out there to get them off their backs, but doesn't actually take seriously. It doesn't bode well, and I think that's why we haven't seen U.S. lawmakers ease off of Canada on this. The House chair on intelligence, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, actually came out with an op-ed last month and then has been in the media, was on CTV a few weeks ago, talking about how Canada is a bigger threat to NATO than the United States is because it doesn't live up to its defense spending commitments. A commitment that we made, by the way, multiple times over the past few years, even when we had the opportunity to back out of it. So it's not well perceived here in the United States. I think across the board, this isn't a partisan issue. One side of the aisle might be more vocal on it than the other, but the general consensus down here in Congress, in the White House, and agencies is that Canada is lagging on defense spending.
In regards to NATO, the President Trump in the past has, articulated a certain perspective on NATO. He's kind of um, implied a certain level of skepticism around NATO, but he's also kind of led the charge on, addressing the fact that maybe not just Canada, but other NATO members might not pull their weight as much as they could. And he seems to now be at the forefront of, perhaps a process whereby the United States might leave European defense a bit more to Europe and pivot potentially to Southeast Asia, focus a bit more on China. Might you be able to comment a bit more on um, what a Trump foreign policy might look like vis-a-vis NATO and particularly Indo-Pacific?
I think that's exactly it. And again, he's been very candid on the campaign trail that his vision for Eastern Europe is to pull the United States out and to have the European allies spend more on defense, spend more supporting Ukraine, um, and to shoulder more of the burden in establishing security and stability in Europe. Canada also falls into that as a founding member of NATO that does not spend 2% on defense. And the view is that the United States cannot be, not that it can't be the world's policeman, but that regional security issues should fall on regional allies more so than on the US. I think there is a genuine desire to pivot to China. Others might disagree on this, but I think the administration's largest overarching foreign policy priority is going to be countering China and engaging in strategic competition with China in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. And so moving away from distractions that pull them away from that, in their view, whether that be Ukraine, whether that be the war in Gaza, just frees up more resources for them to then pivot to China. So, yeah, I think the Trump administration has again been very direct and honest about their policy on this matter, which is that they expect European allies to shoulder more of the burden for European security and stability. Part of that means the United States having a smaller military presence and having its hands in fewer European security issues than it currently does. And I think that will include less funding for NATO, or not NATO, sorry, for Ukraine. I don't know what the picture looks like for defense spending on NATO issues. I don't know what it means for US presence in NATO missions. But broadly on the Ukraine issue, I think they're expecting European allies to step up and shoulder more of that burden. Now, where does that leave Canada is the big question. As we talked about earlier, Canada is seen as being a laggard on defense spending. It's seen as not living up to its potential as a founding member of NATO. I think a lot of those criticisms are reasonable. And again, multi-partisan or bipartisan across the aisle. Democrats, Republicans both think this. So Canada's not going to get off easy on defense spending, even though it's not the issue right now. Again, the border is going to be the issue in the early days of the presidency. But I do think it's going to rear its head at some point, possibly around the next NATO summit, possibly if an international security incident takes place during the early stages of the Trump presidency. It's hard to say when it'll pop up as a top priority again or a major pain point in the Canada-US relationship. But unless something drastic changes, I think it's a matter of when, not if.
Thanks, Savvy. We've been discussing a lot of potential upcoming challenges in the relationship between the United States and Canada. I'm wondering if we might be able to touch on some areas of potential cooperation or mutual areas of interest that our nations both have, and where there might be fruitful engagements in the future with the incoming Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's easy to get caught up in all the bad news, and in all the disputes. Obviously, a 25% universal tariff and the knock-on effects of that would be devastating, both for the Canadian and the US economies. Um, but there's also still a lot of good happening in the Canada-US relationship, whether it's cross-border energy projects, whether it is the continued flow of goods and services across the border, and even big events. There's a lot to look forward to. Look, Canada's hosting the G7 in Kananaskis next year in Alberta. That could be a great opportunity for them to show leadership with the United States in North America, amongst other G7 nations. In 2026, the USMCA review is coming up. A lot of people view that as a challenge, and there likely will be disputes, not just between Canada and the US, but also with Mexico, which, by the way, we could do a whole episode on Mexico and Canada and the whole saga that happened before the tariff announcement came through. But there's going to be a lot happening in North America, not just with that, but also with the World Cup that we're all co-hosting in 2026. So plenty of opportunity for Canada and the US to continue to work together. I think below the federal level, a lot of the state to province, city to city, community to community relations are going to remain strong. And we're just going to have to work through the issues that we have at the highest level to make sure the bilateral relationship stays healthy.
Now, one more question, Zavi, before we begin wrapping up this episode. We obviously discussed cooperation on border security earlier. Obviously, we've got NORAD. Do you see any other areas of incoming or upcoming cooperation on defense in the Canis relationship?
That's a great question, Josh. We do have the ICE Pact, which was signed a few weeks ago. I think that was a major step that sort of flew under the radar because it doesn't have the same profile as AUKUS. But for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a trilateral security pact between Canada, the United States, and Finland to build icebreakers, which the United States and Canada both need desperately. It can mean great things for the shipbuilding industries in North America. Finland, I believe, produces at least 60% of the world's icebreakers and designs another crazy number, I think around 70 or 80% of the world's icebreakers. So they bring a lot of expertise into this. Canada has a lot of shipbuilding expertise as an Arctic nation. This is a very clear and intentional area of collaboration between the two countries, three if you include Finland. And by the way, something that right now enjoys bilateral support here in the United States. I mean, there's broad support for revitalizing US shipbuilding, and if Canada can be a great partner in that, not just for icebreakers, but for other maritime vessels, that's an easy win for the Canada-US defense relationship.
Uh, Zavi, thanks so much for joining us. You've been great, as you always are. A real pleasure to listen to your perspectives. Um, I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts or key ideas you'd like to maybe drive home for our audience before we wrap up today's episode.
Maybe one more on the last question, which is just critical minerals and economic security. Um, if China is taking a high priority in the Trump administration, you have to imagine that de-risking the critical mineral supply chain is going to continue to be a high priority for the US. It was a high priority under Trump 1. It was a high priority under the Biden administration. You have to imagine it's going to continue to be a high priority under Trump 2. And Canada can play a big role in that. I know there's been a lot of criticism around permitting times for projects in Canada from discovery to actually getting the minerals out of the ground and shipped to our partners in the United States. But Canada's considered a domestic market for the U.S. Defense Production Sharing Agreement for a reason. which is that we are a very close ally. We're geographically close, and we can be a major supplier of these critical minerals that are essential for U.S. security. So I look at that as another space where maybe we can see more cooperation between Canada and the U.S. But beyond that, I think we just have to stay attentive. If the saga from the past week has shown us anything, it's that these issues and crises can pop up out of the blue, just based on a Truth Social or Twitter post, um, randomly at 11 o'clock in the evening. So Canadian diplomats and American diplomats, I imagine, will be staying vigilant over the next few months to make sure that everything is running well for Canada-US relations.
Savvy, thanks for joining us. Thanks for all you do, and thanks for your thought leadership. It's been great to cut through some of the noise and just talk some of the logistics and feasibility of some of these issues that we've seen discussed a lot in the media with the Canis relationship. So thank you for joining us. The CDA Institute loves the work of the Canada Institute and the Wilson Center, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Josh, it's always a pleasure. Looking forward to being back.
That brings us to the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to our guest, Xavier Delgado. Until next time.